And hello, and welcome to episode 2 of The Golf War. So in our first episode, hopefully you listened to it. Hopefully you enjoyed that interview with Brad Smith, who I thought was a really good guest to start the show. Brad and I, have known each other for several years now, and I really enjoy talking about golf with him. But we've had a lot of debates over the last couple of years about live golf and the PGA Tour. And just to give you a sense of my background, I'm not somebody that is, at this point in the saga, pro-live, anti-live. I definitely have some concerns with some of the ethical implications of live. But I also understand that there's a lot of frustration to go around with the tour in ways they could improve. So I really enjoyed having that conversation with Brad, because that's a conversation we've had, not on a podcast several times. So I think that was a good conversation for the listeners to get to have. So this week we're going to be talking about the tour's response to Liv's messaging. Just to kind of catch you up, in the first episode we talked about sort of some of the reasons Liv was created in the first place, why maybe it appealed to some of the players, what its messaging was against the tour. And a lot of those, maybe have been worn out at this point in the media. We understand that Liv is offering a really new format, and, there's been a lot of positive, I think, things. One thing Brad mentioned was this sort of team format, which I think is kind of sorely lacking from the game of golf. As a college golfer myself, I can tell you I really enjoy that format, and I think for a lot of people who come up that way, that's definitely a really enjoyable part that's kind of missing from the PGA Tour, other than the Ryder Cup or the President's Cup or maybe a select few events. So this is something that I think Liv is really kind of touched on, that's really worked out for them. But if you just look at some of their messaging against the tour, as we talked about the first time, it's trying to grow the game. It's focusing on how they're really trying to expand not just who watches it, but who plays it. And, one thing Brad mentioned was kind of how the Saudi PIF has actually been involved in women's golf for quite some time, trying to grow the game not just with men, but with women. So I think that's something that, should be celebrated, but, we also have to, imagine maybe where they're coming from, and we'll get to that in later episodes. But this episode is going to be all about the tour's response to Liv's creation, and just from the very beginning, it was very aggressive. And I think it's worth diving into it, because there's a lot of implications to why they went with this strategy. And, not just them, but they had all their players doing the same thing. And this has had kind of repercussions going down. So if you look in the very beginning, when Liv first announced they were coming out, there was this immediate reaction from the tour, and it was very heavy-handed, threatening any players that had said, okay, well, I'm kind of considering doing this. They made it very clear, the tour did, that these players would not be allowed to play on both tours at the same time, and there was threats of, suspensions, which they ultimately followed through on. And the reason that the tour reacted this way, and one thing you have to understand, is that the tour has been around for decades. I think it's been since the 1960s, and it really has not had any serious competition since then. So it kind of has a monopoly on the game of golf, especially here in America. So, you can imagine, in being in their position, how this, new startup tour with a lot of money backing it up could be seen as kind of dangerous to their business model and their product. And indeed, it really was. But a lot of the original messaging from the tour was very emotionally charged, definitely trying to make sure its players got the message, but also the fans and the media. And this is why you see, to some extent, the tour pulling on people's heartstrings, trying to emphasize that they are the, traditional form of golf. This is kind of the untouched way of golf, since this is the way the format has been for decades. Going back to the greats of the game like Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer. So, and then, evolving through the years to Tiger and Rory and all the guys we know now. So, originally this was the tour's messaging, and, a lot of their early critiques of Liv was kind of just focused on the business model and the threat to golf. But they also later started to aggressively attack the money source of LIV, and obviously, why wouldn't you? The Saudi PIF. It wasn't the main critique that the tour used, but it was definitely something that they used to try to, supplant their argument. I think one of the big things that really sticks out in my mind was when the tour kind of organized with the 9/11 survivors' families. If you're not familiar with it, this is a group of families that lost loved ones in the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which is now, in later years, there's been some evidence to suggest that the government of Saudi Arabia was involved at some level. We don't want to just throw that allegation out there, but there's been documents released by the FBI that at least, point to the fact that there was some level of involvement. Obviously, that doesn't mean the entire country is, corrupted in that way, but it's definitely a sensitive topic, especially here in America. So what the tour did is they, realized that this is something that, could potentially work in messaging. So they worked with these families and they put out joint statements attacking LIV's creation and also attacking the American players that went to LIV. You think about players like Dustin Johnson, Patrick Reed, Brooks Koepka, Bryson DeChambeau, who, we'll talk about Bryson actually in a few episodes down the line, but one thing that really sticks out in my mind with Bryson was he went on CNN and kind of did this pretty disastrous interview, if you want my real take on it, where he, essentially tried to be a spokesman for LIV Golf. And unfortunately, he went to do that in a way that was kind of like, yes, 9/11 was bad, but... and that's really never going to be a winning position when it comes to messaging. So that was kind of emblematic of the position the tour was trying to stick LIV. They were trying to stick him into a corner. And, by using the 9/11 families, which I think you could say was maybe, it was definitely selfish by the tour. I'm not sure, based on what's happened later in this saga, that they really had any, serious concerns about those connections between 9/11 and the Saudi government, based on them then agreeing to a potential merger with LIV. But it does go to show you that the tour was definitely engaging in emotional discourse and trying to basically throwing everything at LIV that it could and just seeing what would stick. And so, I think originally what you saw in the response to this messaging was it worked. There's a lot of people, especially older golf fans and, really centralized here in America, that are extremely critical of LIV. And not just because they, are old and they don't like change and they don't like the new format, but they had legitimate concerns about the Saudi PIF involvement in LIV. And they were really kind of disgusted that these players that, in a lot of, fans' perspective, were already doing really well, would go take these giant paydays and basically money that's not coming from, ethical ways. So that's something that the tour was definitely successful in with their messaging because, let's be honest, there's a lot of people who have those concerns. And, I think, honestly, people are not wrong to have those concerns. I think you could point to these, ethical concerns about the Saudi PIF, and I don't think you could fault someone for having those concerns, especially, people who are connected to 9/11. And so I think there is this sense of the tour that this messaging did work in the early stages. And it also, I think, was successful in setting up the media to be very hostile to LIV. And not just because of the, not just because of the outside things happening, but really because the main argument of the tour was that this was divisive for golf. It was bad to split up the best players of the game on different tours, and it was really just a bad thing. It was a money grab, and there was a lot of attacks from the tour, and I do think it worked. And to some extent, LIV has not recovered, but at the same time, and as we'll talk about in the next episode, there are questions about whether the tour's messaging was aided by the media, because as we're going to talk about down the line, the media, is kind of in the tour's pocket. And so it makes it a little bit difficult for them to be a neutral arbiter of this debate. So I do think it's good to kind of maybe think about the tour's messaging, because more so than LIV, I think the Tour's messaging has been extremely effective. And you can just see this in the public opinion polls about who do you support. I just saw one recent project that was just recently studied on this by a Webster student, actually. And what essentially it found was that a lot of, diehard golf fans, even some of the younger fans, are very anti-LIV. And their main concern with LIV is that, A, it's dividing the game of golf, but also the Saudi PIF funding. It's basically what that all means. And so I do think the Tour's messaging has been successful in that regard. But, we're going to call them out down the line in this series because their messaging has not been consistent. And when they take some of the actions they have, which we'll explain, in later episodes, it really makes them look hypocritical. So, essentially, I think the main takeaway from the Tour's messaging against LIV is that they use emotionally charged rhetoric to attack at the very nature of LIV, because essentially they believe that, LIV's structure would not last, that it was kind of threatening the sustainability of golf for future years, and the ethical concerns about where the money was coming from. So, I think those are all very real concerns, and I think the Tour's messaging was successful. I want to thank you for listening to episode 2 of the Golf War, and stay tuned down the line for our next episode, which is going to focus exclusively on media coverage of the LIV PGA Tour debate. Thanks again for listening to episode 2. We'll catch you down the line.